Cool. All right. Well, it's 7 p.m. So welcome to everyone here in the live audience. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's event discussing No Pasarán, Antifascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis, featuring editor Shane Burley, moderating a discussion with contributors Hilary and Ryan Smith. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the occupied lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that specializes in titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. Firestorm is also a community event space. Due to the pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. But with that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. Next Thursday, November 10th, we'll host a discussion on the new release from PM Press, Zapatista Stories for Dreaming Another World. So if you're interested in signing up for that or any of the other events happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. Quick note for folks who are attending live in the audience tonight. Tonight's speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll just encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the live stream. Cool. Moving on to tonight's speakers. Shane Burley is an author based in Portland, Oregon. He is the author of Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It, and is the editor of the collection Why We Fight: Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse. Hilary is a political educator, a writer, and organizer. She co-authored No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and Lessons for Today's Movements with James Tracy, and lives in Louisville, Kentucky. Ryan Smith is an anti-fascist heathen organizer, teacher, and writer. He is the author of The Way of Fire and Ice, The Living Tradition of Norse Paganism, and lives in San Francisco, California. So Shane, Hilary, Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time to be here tonight and share your work with us. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Shane.
Hey, thanks, Ash. Thanks so much to Firestorm, for everyone coming out and being a part of this. This book was a longer process than anything else I've ever worked on. This was started back in 2018, became a 4-year process of putting something like this together, talking to people and building up conversations with the idea of being, how do we open up this question of anti-fascism? Most of what's been written on anti-fascism since the big explosion of interest in 2015, 2016 has been from a very, very narrow point of view, often based in kind of like punk or anarchist subcultures or in socialist milieus, but very, very narrow on what that exactly means. And we know, as people going out into the streets and being part of demonstrations and pushing back on the far right, that it's much bigger than that. We're talking about happening across all communities, all different walks of life, different kinds of people, and different kinds of strategies for doing that. And we want to see that grow. We want that to be something that marks not just the left, but all of our communities, no matter how you designate yourself. We want that to be sort of a living tradition that goes forward. And so the goal was to, instead of just trying to document all these different trends that are emerging, was just to hear from a group of folks. So now we put together the book. It's a big one. It's over 200,000 words, about 500 pages, over 25 chapters of folks bringing in all kinds of perspectives about strategies, about different areas, geographies, international, about different histories, and trying to put that together and say, like, this is anti-fascism sort of in a broad view. These are the different experiences, the different people and different voices. So I wanted to bring together Hilary and Ryan specifically in this conversation because both of their chapters have some interlocking themes when you kind of look at what they get into. So I'm going to kick it off by talking to Hilary and asking, where did your idea for doing a chapter that looks at anti-fascist fight clubs, why are they so significant and what drew you to talking about it?
Yeah, first off, just thanks for having me, Shane. And thanks, of course, to Firestorm Books. Yeah, so why fight clubs came onto my radar is very much just in response to everyday life. I was living in Berlin, Germany. I was training at a local gym there, doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They had other sports, combat sports there, and that was just the milieu that I was a part of while I was living in Berlin for a few years. And one of our fighters at that gym went professional and had a professional fight. And so a bunch of us were like, yeah, this is our friend, let's go support them. And I invited a couple of other friends with me to go. And my friend Vincent, who like dabbled in boxing, and we were just like, cool, let's eat fries and watch people beat the shit out of each other. So that was like, it was just gonna be a fun night. And you know, it was a fun night, and it got down to the final match. And that whole night, Vincent and I were cracking jokes about like, oh man, that guy's totally a fascist. No, that guy's totally a fascist, knowing that that is a really not great thing to do in your everyday life, is like do that pointing. But by the final fight and what had happened around us, it became very clear that we were surrounded by a lot of fascist people. One of the final fight speakers, or the fighters, kind of knocked out the other dude, and then all around us, this regional neo-Nazi chant broke out. And pretty quickly we booked it out of there. And just a few minutes after we left, we found the dude that they were chanting for. We found his face and information about him in an anti-fascist report around neo-Nazi activity in Dresden, which is about a 2-hour drive south of Berlin in the east side. And just to say, like, that whole event super rocked me. I'm new still to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world, but I had been in a couple of years by now, and the purchase that far-right activity had really threw me. And so pretty immediately I contacted like my coach who was there that night and other people who are in my like anti-fascist research networks, because I had done a lot of research up to that point, just to try to understand the breadth and the scope and the purchase that they were having in combat sports networks. And really that brought me to like learning more about far-right networks in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Poland and Greece and Italy. And everywhere you find fascists, you find anti-fascists. And so what started out as like, I need to know more about what we're up against, and finding out what that network is like and what they're doing with whom and how, to then finding the resistance in all of these different places and the different tactics they're taking up based on those sites. So that was like kind of how I came into understanding, oh, there's my dog. That was kind of how I came into understanding the purchase of that. But then what the piece really became, I'm gonna let my dog out real quick, hold on.
Go for it. Well, Ryan, oh, okay, you're back. Yeah, go for it.
Just to wrap it up there, sorry about that. My dog is Winnie. She does love to participate in anything I do, so just bring her in. Anyways, what started out as like research around these far-right groups really became an exploration of the different tactics of ways that people are resisting and organizing themselves in resistance. And really, I saw that as like a counterforce. A lot of people saw that work as a counterforce to what they were up against and especially in Germany, like with, especially around 2015, with the shift in migration patterns and a lot of refugees seeking asylum in Germany, like an uptick in self-defense classes for white women and having that be really racialized and really racist. And so in response to that, right, then there's a whole bunch of Flint or female, lesbian, intersex, non-binary, trans gyms really meant to empower Flint communities, but with a really anti-racist point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a whole bunch of different examples about that, about how their particular context added up to the way that they fight back. I could say more about that, but I'll maybe pass it before my dog starts chiming in again. So,
well, see, it seems like it's sort of two things. So on the one hand, it's defensive, like it's actually training people for defense,
yeah,
which in a way is implicit to anti-fascism, is community self-defense. So, and similarly, before we had hopped on with everyone, we were talking about gun groups. I was talking about doing an event with a number of gun groups like John Brown Gun Club and SRA. And so like there's that defensive element, it's training people to defend themselves. But then there's like the second element too, which is both creating a space for people who need it, but also like sort of battling it out in the space, like basically saying like, no, like MMA itself is not like this, just a far right cesspool unopposed. Do you think that they've accomplished like both things in doing this?
I think it's real mixed. And I think it depends, of course, as everything does, on who the folks are and their commitment to that place doing something over time. I know folks in Poland really see themselves like they organize their fighting gym on those multiple levels simultaneously, which is like pretty fucking wild and requires actually a lot of infrastructure. And I only saw that there because they've been in a squat for 40 years and they just have like fucking domination of this one place in Poznan. And I'm like, okay, that's special and unique, right? Those conditions don't exist everywhere, but they simultaneously have a fighting league, like they actually have people who are there to fight. And that was actually not so common. Most often the gyms I talked to or came across were coming at it more of like okay, this is where we like stay active and like stay engaged, but mostly about community building and mostly a space to basically have a public presence that finds that nice balance between being accessible, like anybody can come to this gym. We want everyday fucking people to come to this gym and be active in their lives. And we're not gonna throw the politics into their face to where they're alienated, and we're not gonna background it to where they don't even know why we're doing this, but it's gonna like find that good balance and bring those folks in. And I think that really varies, but I think a really important other point that the Poznan Gym does, which I think is really proactive, is that they send their fighters and even people who are just like leisurely competing to many kinds of gyms. So it's not like only anti-fascists are with anti-fascists, but they use it as a temperature check to see how other gyms, other networks are being leveraged and are being utilized by different networks, far-right networks. So in some ways it's like gathering data, it's getting conditioned, it's finding community, and it's actually for some people, not everybody, but for some, building the skills that you need to actually do street fighting.
It seems like this difficult balance between like having like a space that's not that where politics aren't maybe the reason people walk in there, and maybe it shouldn't be, right? Like, and this happens a lot. And I think, Ryan, we could talk about this too. I think there was a generation of anti-fascist and radical musicians that were just pretty bad. And I remember asking Margaret Killjoy, who wrote a chapter in this about this with fiction. And her point was, well, the skills it takes to be like a radical organizer are not the skills it takes to do these other things necessarily. And assuming that one and the same, or that something that lines up with you politically is somehow going to be good is just like totally wrong. And so I think it's an interesting balance for how you keep politics present with allowing it to be authentically what it is in a way. Ryan, like, how did you, I think when people look at your chapter, they may not have guessed that metal and heathenry would be the things that work together. It seemed pretty natural to me, but maybe you could unpack why you went that direction for folks that didn't make that connection right off the bat.
Well, I think the first place that I go to with it is it's kind of, you can take it as writ that Vikings are metal. And I don't think that many people are going to debate that in terms of, pop culture and associations and stuff. But the I went in that direction particularly because there is a lot of overlap between both of these subcultures, and these are also both communities that I'm involved with to different degrees. More as like, a participant within heavy metal as opposed to like writing and doing organizing within heathenry. But I think that from my experience in both, they had some very similar dynamics going on of a prevailing culture where if you actually sat down with a lot of people one-on-one and just had conversations with them about, hey, like those guys over there are literally Nazis. Do we really want to have this in this space? And one-on-one, it wouldn't be hard to get people to agree, yeah, Nazis are bad. We shouldn't have Nazis and bigots in our spaces. But there was a broader pressure within both of these communities to not rock the boat around the question. That like the thing that was the big problem wasn't so much that people weren't aware of it. Is like when a lot of information started coming out in heathen circles about Stephen McNallen and his organization, the Ossetry Folk Assembly, showing they were basically carbon copied from Christian identity. The thing that was one of the things that stuck with me with that was there were a lot of people that were more experienced within that community who knew about some of these things, or even several of these different things, like McNallen writing an essay saying that migration from Mexico and Central America is a holy war ordered by the Aztec gods to wipe out white people, really hair-raising stuff. And this was stuff that was known, but nobody was really saying anything because there was the perception that we can't push these people out, because they're too influential, or more generally because there's a sense in both of these cultures, and I also think in paganism more broadly as well, of this feeling of that these are cultures that define themselves by being at least in their minds outsiders to some aspect of mainstream society and culture. So there is this tendency to say, well, this other person is also in this same place of feeling like they don't fit in out there. Who am I to show them the door, to say they're not welcome in here? Kind of pressure. And I can understand where that mentality comes from, that sense of that because we're the ones who are out on the fringe, we can't exactly be kicking people out that are coming to us and say they want to be part of this community. And they also both metal and heathenry also seem to have a similar trajectory in terms of what has developed within anti-fascism in both places since, of starting from there wasn't really much of a conversation beyond just don't bring it up, don't rock the boat, to where on like the music side, you're increasingly seeing a lot more, not just conversation, but artists making statements, explicitly anti-fascist black metal groups like Dawn Raid, and also like just sort of the generally like increasing awareness within the community, as well as exclusion of National Socialist black metal. And similarly within heathenry, you have like more specific moments like Declaration 127, which was a big joint statement signed by something like, I think it's 190 some odd groups from around the world, jointly saying the Ossetry Folk Assembly is not part of our community, it does not represent us, and we do not consider them to be in community with us anymore, and they're just not welcome in any of our spaces. And that was something that was like a big shift from, like I said, that earlier status quo that both these communities shared, of a lot of pressure not to push back, but not necessarily because the fascist organizing within those spaces was so overwhelming that it couldn't be beaten, but because people didn't want to create a scene, basically. Like I guess you could say in both places everybody was listening to the centrists a little too much.
Yeah, so you interviewed both black anti-fascist black metal bands and heathens, folks who follow the northern pagan traditions, about it. What do you feel like were some of the main lessons that they had taken? Like, how are they doing this work? And one thing I think is interesting is when I started writing Fascism Today, this was not the case. Like, there was not a giant anti-fascist black metal scene, and racialized Nordic paganism was pretty common. The first time I went to a pagan pride day many years ago, Austria Folk Assembly was there, and they were considered totally fine, totally in good standing, and their politics are open white nationalism. So that would never fly now. Like, they are completely excommunicated from those spaces. So what did you learn from talking to folks?
I think the biggest thing was getting people to move. Like, that was like the biggest shared point for both, was just for people who are in like spaces where there is a lot of different fascist organizing and activity, that it's essential for people who are opposed to that to talk to each other, to work together, and to approach it from a perspective of building power than winning arguments. Because like I said before, like, one-on-one, you could get people to agree with you. And there are definitely places where dialogue and argument can work, but that only works if everybody is taking everybody in good faith and already is agreeing to respect each other's perspectives. It wasn't, and that was also kind of part of what I think held up things, particularly in heathenry, was inclusive groups trying to make the good argument and trying to show the right, basically the right set of facts and the right framing will make this go away. And the thing we learned in Heathens United Against Racism, which was one group that I helped bring together for networking people to basically be more effective in opposing fascism within heathenry, is it's not really about how effective the line of argument is. It's about, do you have organized community? Do you have people that are capable of actually getting things done in a coherent manner? And can you present yourselves as a genuine alternative while also maintaining a strongly anti-fascist line? Like, that seemed to do much more in both cases. Of like, part of where like the anti-fascist black metal scene, at least from what I've seen, comes from, is that similar kind of place of artists saying, no, we're going to actually do this, and we're going to put this forward and make this what it is that we do, and also take this out and bring this into the broader metal scene, and not just keep this going within like particular niche places.
I mean, I think it's sort of true with both of the scenes you're both talking about, that I think people do sort of write off as like a fascist, basically dumpster fire. Not wrongly either in a lot of ways, right? Like, I mean, I get why that, but that does seem to be what the assumption is about MMA in a lot of ways. Yeah. Maybe like the Joe Roganification of MMA. And then also the same thing with heathenry, because of the visibility of groups like the AFA and just the use of heathen imagery, even from non-religious white nationalists. And then black metal, same thing. So, but I think like part of what's happening here is that people aren't actually abandoning them, because when people say, kind of allow them to take that space, they sort of like cede that ground entirely and say, okay, if you like black metal, that's theirs, we'll get rid of it. People sort of kind of strip it out of themselves. But I think in a way what you're describing is the willingness to go in and fight them so as to win, so as to like literally strip them out of it. So I think like for both of you, why do you think that there's a useful in staying in, like, in keeping those things?
Yeah, I mean, I could go to town on this thing. I'll keep it short though, so you get to speak, Ryan. Oh man, there's so many reasons. I think one on my side of things is that MMA is one of the fastest growing entities, phenomenon in the world in the definitely last 15 years, but especially the last 5 years. And so there's a lot of power to it. It has a lot of visibility. It has a lot of funding and resources behind it. And that's like high up MMA, but also, more local fight scenes, as well as like amateur and like moderately professional. It's a space that has a lot of power in and of itself. The sport itself, I talk about this in the chapter, right? It animates ideas and brings beliefs into practice in a very, very concrete way. Why somebody is fighting is just as compelling as how they are fighting and if they win. But the other thing for me and other poor and working class white folks, and I do organizing with white people showing up for racial justice. It's all about what space are we conceding, and especially around culture wars, and especially around who the right is going after. often young people, often disaffected youth, often poor and working class folks that are struggling to get shit done anyways in their life. And so these are outlets for them. These are spaces where our people are, and I don't want to give up my people to the far right. So they are spaces that I don't necessarily think that we're going to reclaim and like they are ours, but there needs to be presence of other kinds of people with different beliefs fighting for different things available to be seen and heard and felt. And the other thing I think is like these gyms, there's a shit ton of toxic masculinity and misogyny and bullshit. Even in the gym that I go to here in Louisville, Kentucky, they're super skilled, lovely people, and it's very hard to stomach. I'm not going to like sugarcoat it at all. It is a space that unfortunately, if you want those skills, you have to like participate in unless you find and make your own little niche. But often you're starting off with people at a similar skill level than you, which is more than community-based and not necessarily about gaining those skills. So for me, at least, why I stay in and why I support the especially femme people, non-binary people, trans people to stay in these spaces, if they're able to and if they have a desire to, is so we can get the fucking skills that we need and bring them back to our organizing, bring them back to our community so that when we see the folks on the street who we actually probably go to the same gym with, we have something that we can bring to the table and fight back. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of reasons why, but those are my top hits. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, that hits a lot of mine. And just to add to that, I think particularly in the cases of like heathenry and in heavy metal, there is, even though these are scenes that tend to be written off by more mainstream opinion as well, those are fascist dumpster fires, there's nothing we can do about it. From being inside both of those, I can say that there's nothing about these things that inherently makes them fascist. There's really very few institutions in society that you could say are, or not necessarily institutions, sorry, but like subcultures or different cultural expressions that are necessarily inherently fascist, just because there is an appearance of something that might be associated with that. And fascism really is big about being sort of like almost like a cultural virus in a way. Like it isn't really very good at coming up with its own stuff that's appealing to people. They have to grab onto something that somebody else already did and turn it around and make it into theirs for it to be effective. Like even the word fascism was the fascist party riffing on a symbol of the Italian labor movement, the fascio, which was literally a bundle of sticks, like going back to Spartacus and all that. So I think that that's why it's essential to fight them from inside these kind of communities, because both there's nothing about them that's inherently fascistic. In fact, I would say there's a lot that's against that. Like when you look at all of heavy metal from when it started by a bunch of working class boys from Birmingham, playing something different and down tuning a guitar, to like some of the more like a lot of the stuff that's out on the like coming out now, there's always been a through line in heavy metal of flipping the bird to a lot of the assumptions of mainstream society and expressing something that is loudly and aggressively not part of that, and doing something different and exploring in things that are taboo as a way of developing greater freedom and greater expression. And there's a lot of like things like anti-militarism and other stuff that goes back to like Black Sabbath's War Pigs and Metallica, and as well as like Napalm Death and all kinds of other bands throughout the history of the genre. You also have like Dimebag Darrell running around with a Confederate flag, and National Socialist black metal and lots of other really awful stuff. And that's absolutely there as well. And there's totally lots of problems with toxic masculinity, but it strikes me that it doesn't make sense for metal to be something that is fascist, because when you look at the folks that tend to be involved in heavy metal, those tend to also be the people who end up getting either forced to conform or crushed when fascist regimes rise. Like these are the kinds of expressions that when Franco fell were some of the first things that popped up in Spain, was some really kind of wild stuff. And that's part of it. I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. This shouldn't be in this camp. They shouldn't have any kind of foothold here. And I know from heathenry, the first places where heathenry emerged were in the modern sense were in Scandinavia, and they were all very aggressively inclusive. They even like one particular example that I like to share from Sweden is how they developed their understanding of particularly Scandinavian forms of mysticism and reconstructing something that kind of worked, as well as doing a bit of invention and revival along the way, was they got in contact with a number of like folks who were originally from the Andes, who during the 1970s, and because of stuff the US was doing with the CIA and overthrowing governments and Pinochet, these folks had relocated to Sweden, which had much more generous asylum laws. And these different practitioners from the Andes got in touch with Swedish heathens. And that's part of where their modern understanding of different forms of trance practice came from, was that kind of mutual exchange of ideas. So it's like within, and the same kind of thing also shows up in the source material. If there were exchanges with like the nearby Sami peoples and other groups, there just isn't really, there's just so much that's within the mythology as well as how it's come out, particularly in the modern age, that it doesn't, there's a lot that just isn't fascistic and is actually kind of anti-fascist and anti-authoritarian in its own way. So it makes no sense to me why fascists should have any claim to this. And I think leaving subcultures, like just writing them off as there's nothing we can do about this, it's labeled as fascist, they're done, makes safe havens for fascists to organize and come back later. Like if the goal is to not see it happen again, then you can't write off cultural spaces as well, that's theirs and they can have it, because that doesn't work.
The Rural Organizing Project used to tell the story about Aryan nations. The Rural Organizing Project organizes small towns in Oregon. I think they have about 50 chapters around Oregon. And the Aryan nations, which was centered in Hayden-Newake, Idaho, used to come over and they'd do a flyer drop everywhere. And they'd wait to see if this didn't really create any problems. And if it didn't, then they might come and hand them out. And then if that was good, then they would escalate. They might have a meeting and then they'd go door to door and that kind of thing. Basically, what they were looking for wasn't pushback so they could have like a big event or call themselves victims. They wanted nothing. They wanted it to be a totally cleared out space. And the reality is that a lot of rural areas had been abandoned by the left and people wouldn't come out. They would see that and be like, hey, that happens out in rural Oregon. That's just kind of what goes on out there. And so I think it's useful to look at what spaces do people actually intentionally trying to come into, then go into those. Like we should be, if the ARA motto of going where they go stands, then we have to go there. And like, I also think there's something about being authentically where you are. Like, I think, and actually, Hilary's book on John Brown, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, speaks to this too, is that the experience of white organizers means that they can address white communities in a particular way, and that holds a certain responsibility. And I feel like this is the same reason why you see so many Jewish Palestinian support groups, is because Jews are in Jewish spaces authentically themselves and talking to other Jews and confronting in those ways. So I think that it ends up being sort of like tactically useful in a sense. Like we were talking about actual organizing, it's useful in that way. But I also like push it against this need for like mass movements. We're talking about like a really large far right, like an astounding kind of level. Some of the recent stuff coming out from some of like the actual GOP party members sound like it would have been for white nationalist organizations 20 years ago, like really extreme stuff. And so we're talking about something that we can't basically take on subculturally. So I'm like curious how you think about how you balance this idea of like taking these songs in what can be really micro fights, like really small localized fights in gyms, in scenes, but then also like this need for like a big mass movement. How do those things like kind of track alongside each other?
I'll kick it off.
Yeah.
I think we have the horrible and amazing task to do many things at the same time. We are conditioned to do that under this moment of capitalism for shitty reasons, and maybe we can use that skill for the things that we need and want and long for. But I think kind of what you already pulled out, Shane, is a lot of what we can grow and emphasize in our anti-fascist work, which is how to still be connected to mass movements. I'm part of a mass organization. We do lots of strategies and tactics, and we aim them towards a better world, of an abolitionist world, an anti-capitalist world. And it looks a lot of different ways depending on where we have chapters or projects. So I am committed, I am absolutely rooted in a mass project and a mass movement. And I also live in Louisville, Kentucky on Osage, Shawnee, and Cherokee territory. And so there's particular projects that I am invested in here, that I am part of creating here, community defense groups here, that is trying to find the particular niche in which we get to maintain ground, gain ground, push ground. And I think that subcultures have always been a place to contest. Not the place, not the only place. There's so many different terrains that we have to engage in, even ones that we don't want to engage in this political moment. I voted today, y'all. Like, it is one tactic among many. But I also think that subcultures are yet another tool in our anti-fascist tool belt or pocket or whatever the fuck we want to call it. Just because that has always been a site in which different far-right actors have engaged, and they do that intergenerationally. Shane brought up No Fascist USA. We kind of chart out how, especially in Chicago and different places, but older generations of like the Klan and American Nazi Party really leveraged younger groups, really leveraged like racist skinheads and other subcultures and graffiti groups to kind of carry out their message. They were their foot soldiers. And so kind of taking, I would say, capturing folks that the left threw away, or mobilizing folks that like just got them at the right time, their hearts and minds at the right time. And so I think the ability to, say for the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, if you want to go to a recent historical example, is like they were a national network. There's many things I could say about them. They were a national network. They were really fucking committed to supporting movements for self-determination. And they saw themselves as a buffer between the far-right actors that were coming after those movements, and then being white folks that were able to take up that space to kind of be that buffer and to push back and then get more folks in trying to build a mass movement. Different places saw different things, but they really tried to build local coalitions eventually in their arc of things. They tried to build local coalitions that had a strong subculture strength to them to bring in people. And then also basically to introduce them to the politics of self-determination and what it is to take a proactive stance to confront white nationalism, white supremacy. And there's no formula to it. You actually have to have a good idea and some inspiration from people who came before us. There's many, but then to find what actually works for you in your context. But it's that oscillation. It's that like simultaneous move of something so fucking particular, as well as being connected to something very general that you are a part of. And I think that's something that I think is super important, is to never be an individual in this work. Of course, you can take individual action, but you have to be connected to more people who are either in like minds and you're organizing with and sharing ideas with, or you have like actual principles that you're committed to and organizing around, and you're in concerted community together. That's a whole other thing, but I think to point out what Shane was talking about, you have to do both at the same time. What do you think, Ryan?
Well, I think to add to what you said, I think one particular thing that subcultures offer is, as far as like an organizing opportunity almost, is while it is true that there's no particular subculture that could be described as a decisive terrain of struggle, I think collectively subcultures generally can be, because of the ways that they, to an extent, can get around different societal and cultural boundaries. In a lot of ways, you could say that the development of subculture in the modern United States, starting with like 60s youth culture up to the present day, is in part a product of that a lot of the older, more established like markers for community of things like particular like ethnic European enclaves, which was much more a thing before the Second World War than it is after. The association of a fixed place of work, like, the factory town, stuff like that, the role of the labor union socially, like all of these things were starting to break down in the 1960s and truly begin to break down in the 70s and 80s. So in some ways, subculture didn't exactly take the place of those things, but has kind of filled the gaps in some ways. And that's something that I think can be very valuable, because you can get situations like what I've seen within heathenry as well as within metal, that it can be somewhat easier in some ways to get people to move around, like to mobilize around a shared interest or a shared goal, not necessarily by appealing to them as well, broad concepts of like internationalism or something like that, but more saying, hey, we're both in this community, we both share a lot of the same kind of interests and desires and goals. You're in Denmark, I'm over here, let's collaborate on this thing. Or hey, we've got to share this information. Or you can get the kind of a kind of situation of like where you'll have folks that are like, hey, I'm over here, I need to get I'm somebody who's working on the ground in these different clubs, and I've got this information, and they're posting it up in, like, say, an anti-fascist metal board, and or maybe someone else on there who is a tech specialist who also is really into heavy metal, or somebody who knows people who can put pressure onto specific business owners. So there's ways that I think subcultures can circumvent and move around some of the barriers that we usually think of towards organizing, because they create their own social relationships that can, help foster these connections in a different way. So like, I don't think, turning heavy metal anti-fascist is going to decisively beat the Republican Party's march to fascism or anything like that, but it definitely would be a piece of being able to undermine those different networks, of like being able to do things like approach somebody on the grounds of, hey, I like metal, you like metal, let's talk about this thing, and being able to get around labels of things like conservative or liberal or left versus right or what have you, and arrive at a more genuinely inclusive and liberatory perspective.
I think it's also like acknowledging that we're in multiple communities simultaneously. Like we say community a lot as if it's like this simple term or it's only geography that we're talking about, but we're actually like kind of in overlapping circles at all points in time, with overlapping identities at the same way and different ways of interacting in those spaces. And so I think like in a way, it's like all strategies. I mean, you have these different options for how to go about it. And it's sort of the same question of how do you build larger communities? How do you build coalitions? How do you make it so people who are different work together? Like it's a big sort of question in general. I'm sort of like curious how you're seeing things change. And also, folks, put questions if you have them down the Q&A thing, and I'll start running through them. But I'm sort of curious how people are seeing stuff change. There was we've seen a huge change in the far right over the last year, and it's not all been good. Like the alt-right has sort of declined really heavily in all the organizations associated with it, from deplatforming and from anti-fascist organizing shutting it down. But there's like some kind of not essentially newer trends, but like maybe revived trends, like we see with the OK Groomer phenomenon, with the attack on Pride events, the unbelievable assault on trans healthcare, just like the overwhelming, just like basically warfare on trans folks, particularly trans kids. How are you seeing that this kind of stuff change? What's kind of concerning you and having impacting your sense on where to organize defense?
Should we keep the same rhythm here, Ryan?
Go for it. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll just speak from my experience being here in Kentucky. I would say they have become very bold and celebratory about rolling back access to abortion, and how that has been a huge fight here for anybody who has a uterus, as well as like anybody who cares about anybody who has a uterus. While right now access is defunct, it was just on the ballot to try to regain that access. And in terms of like just the boldness and the crassness of that celebration, that's been really huge. And so if anything, we are pivoting more into like supporting people to find the medical procedures that they need, and regardless of what happens on with the ballot. And I think the other piece that's really standing out in Kentucky is just the ability for the far right to respond where the state has abandoned or divested from communities, which is pretty strong here in Kentucky, especially Eastern Kentucky. So whether it was the tornado that hit in December 2021, where 90 people died in Western Kentucky, or the huge floods that devastated much of Eastern Kentucky, that are still pretty much devastated. Like for instance, there's militia groups from nearby states that are coming into Eastern Kentucky with supplies, water, food, but also with their ideas and their connections to different law enforcement groups, and how much that's very much a part of our anti-fascist organizing, whether you call yourself an anti-fascist or not. People's needs, basic needs, this isn't a new strategy at all, but how much room there is, especially for states like Kentucky that maybe coastal places have written off. I'm a Californian. I grew up on in the foothills of California, and I would say it was through my politicization of being an anti-racist white organizer and an anti-imperialist and fighting for my people to come with us towards liberation, where I found organizers and organizing in Kentucky to be some of the most fucking cutting edge in the country at this moment. And this is why I moved here. This is why I came. And so if all that to say is like, in this state, not only because of abandonment by the state, but also from left movements, there's just an up for grabsness here in Kentucky that leaves a lot open for whatever far-right actors, whether in the state or nearby, to come in and to gather our folks. So if anything, the moves that I think that anti-fascists can make there's a lot of it in the themes of your book, Shane, and what you've been talking about for lots of years in terms of the making anti-fascism beyond the choir and just accessible in everyday life, and whether it's very small acts, but kind of labeling what we know to be anti-fascism also beyond subcultures, and kind of making the membership very, very wide. And so for the folks that are actively trying to kick out those militia groups who are bringing water, we simultaneously need water and like supplies in Eastern Kentucky, and they're still having a political line of like, but not from these fuckers. Like that is like hardcore anti-fascism. Those grannies out there, those young people out there who decided to stay in Eastern Kentucky, those are my fucking heroes. And so if anything, I want that kind of anti-fascism to be much more seen, much more celebrated, much more uplifted and supported.
On speaking from what I'm seeing inside of like heathen and pagan spaces, as well as sort of in like metal and also related, like, goth scenes and stuff like that, I think what part of what's been happening is they have gotten a lot more blatant. And sorry, hold on one sec.
Is it a dog?
The dogs are the bane on this. Like my cat's trying to get in right now.
Yeah, we can have dog time later. But yeah, I think that from what I'm seeing within those spaces, they have gotten a lot more blatant. Part of that, I think, is at least particularly in the case of the Asatru Folk Assembly, they and the Odinic Right and other specific heathen Nazi organizations have gotten more overtly blatant, in part because there have been a number of different power struggles within those groups that were triggered by the failure of McNallen's previous approach, which was, try to cover things over with nice sounding language as much as possible, come up with excuses that will appeal to like a pagan friendly or new age crowd, and don't shout the Nazi stuff too loudly in public. And that's kind of part of what they'd been doing for a long time. And I think that the growth and effectiveness of things like Declaration 127 has led to those particular, like basically that particular old guard losing power, because the fact that Declaration 127 happened proved that did not work. That doing that kind of suit and tie thing had eventually failed, even though it had worked for them for years before. I think part of it is that, but also part of it is just generally that, like most subcultures, like, I mean, even there's like that Atlantic article about My Little Pony white nationalist fans. I think that in what's also at work generally is that most subcultures are in their own way a reflection of what's going on in society. They aren't, even though a lot of them like to think of themselves as being removed and insular, like particularly if you're talking things like different elements of the metal scene or the pagan scene, also like quite a lot of like chunks of like the gaming world. But I think that that doesn't have as much truth as people would like it to be, because again, we have those overlapping identities. People still have to go out and go to work, go to school, like do all the other stuff that's part of living in modern, like super neoliberal mess America. So that this blatantness is happening, I think, is a reflection of also what's going on in broader society, that these groups are not as removed from this as they'd like to think they are. And I think that also part of that, along with just that these people are getting a lot more brazen, is there does seem to be a sort of unanswered tension, particularly within like heavy metal and pagan fascisms, that's arising because the loudest expression of far right stuff in the United States and worldwide is very loudly and aggressively Christian, in a way that encourages like suppression and persecution of groups that don't fit within a very narrow vision of what society is supposed to look like. And that vision absolutely excludes pretty much all of the heavy metal and pagan worlds. So I talked with some other folks about this before coming on, just to like get a bit of a temperature check. And for the most part, it seems like the answer coming from the far right, like pagans and our alternative far right people, seems to be, well, we'll fight that war when we get to it. But I think that something's going to give there sooner or later, because there's just, you know, like as this stuff escalates, the people who are doing a lot of the groomer stuff I don't think they're going to make any point of drawing distinctions, even if these white nationalists say they agree with them on like hating trans people and everything else. They still aren't ticking all the right boxes.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was first sort of like covering fascist stuff, most people, if they had a religious bent in those circles, were kind of checking the pagan box, or like it was performative checking. It might not have been a super sincere religious conviction or something, but that was certainly there. It was in the circles around neo-folk and the early alt-right and stuff, and that's totally flipped. And we have movements like Groypers and stuff kind of on the heels of white Christian nationalism. That is the thing now. And it's proving in a way a lot more successful than it had before. But part of it is, again, like stuff like Declaration 127, which did push those groups back really heavily. It basically shut down a lot of their functionality, which made their part actually shrink a great deal. But it also seems like some of these Christian groups are now protesting pagan events and stuff. Like it's actually started to turn itself. Like, are you seeing that like in a religious community that you're being targeted by this sort of this new kind of wave of like really arrogant Christian nationalism?
I mean, it's always been there to some extent, because like that kind of arrogant Christian nationalism is like, I mean, I grew up in Southern California and like suburban San Diego, and we'd have a dude standing out in front of the high school handing out free Bibles to people every day. And Jack Chick tracts were a thing all over the place. And so sorry, where was I going with that? Oh yeah, but like there has always been that, like pagan shops have always had a certain level of harassment that just sort of seems to, like, there isn't really a comparable like analog in like the metal scene. There used to be like record stores, but you know, like metal bars are much more a thing in Europe than they are in the United States. So like so I guess what we can point to is pagan shops, and they've always had a certain level of it that really depends on, that mostly depended on whether or not the local, especially fire and brimstone preacher, was particularly pissed off about the pagans down the street that week. But it wasn't anything that's really like been reaching the kind of intensity we're seeing now. Like it was definitely stuff like the local newspaper publishing like full page editorials talking about how pagan pride in San Diego was going to be like eating babies in public or something like that. But there never was like at the level of these guys are showing up and getting physical and being actively confrontational. Like it did happen in a few cases, but I think part of that is just the incredibly diffuse and underground nature of the community means there just aren't really visible targets, even though you could go back like 10, 12, 14 years and find any number of very mainstream right-wing publications like the Federalist or the American Conservative, or Newt Gingrich at the 2012 RNC convention saying things like environmentalism is like a Trojan horse for paganism and Gaia worship and all kinds of stuff like that. So I think that the growing visibility of pagan practice, which I think is linked to that we are in climate crisis, and that does tend people to look at different, more ecological kinds of spirituality. But it is something new, like the scale and the extent to which it's happening. Like there is supposed to be, like there's been threats against a pagan market in Texas that's coming up this weekend. That I haven't heard anything particular on that, but the local church is promising to show up in force. And these are people that have hung out with the Proud Boys before. So it's something different. And it is something much more intense, I think.
Yeah, thinking about Hilary, what you had kind of raised, it reminded me of out here, we had the same kind of dynamic in a lot of rural areas where the militias did provide, I guess, like they filled the gap in state services, right? Like they actually provided stuff. So, like, and I think this is the sort of the dynamic that gets missed in a lot of just urban centers. Like some of the areas of Oregon has no cell service. They don't have ambulance service. Some places actually have really sketchy running water. Like there's like huge parts that don't really have access to water or stable electricity. No things like no high-speed internet. And like you might have to, use your phone and travel half an hour from your home. So when this happened in kind of Southwest Oregon, where I think I'm trying to remember, the River Creek Militia or one of them started offering basically to give people rides to the hospital, and do other things like that. And people were happy for it. They were recruiting really great. The people needed a lot of support there, especially with like an older demographic out in super rural areas. So like the Rural Organizing Project, which I mentioned before, like went in and helped a few people to make like a community center. So it was like in the general store, and they put like a computer there, and then they worked with them to make a newsletter, and then like a phone tree to get to know your neighbor. And after about a year, the person who was the person bringing the militia in, like wrote an op-ed saying, we don't want this anymore. We accomplished everything we wanted by just getting to know our neighbors, and now they created different plans and things like that. So the militia had no one to sort of pull from anymore because they'd been effectively organized with, but which I think is like, it's a really bright spot. But I was also thinking back in like 2020, we had obviously the growth of mutual aid groups around the pandemic and was great and stable. So when the 2020 protests started happening, particularly in Portland, they could sustain the protests, right? And there was healthcare support, there was food support, rides, a whole bunch of fundraising to bail people out, people to get people home when they're bailed out. It was all great and stuff. And then when the forest fire started happening, it was like about 12% of the state was on fire. So it was like really significant. Those groups immediately pivoted to doing fire support. But what a lot of them found was when they were driving into the fire areas to go like get people out and stuff, they were stopped by militias that said, we think you're here to start fires, and we'll with guns, we'll stop you from entering. So it was sort of like the option they had, like the mutual aid option they had to change the conditions, they're suddenly disallowed from using. Like that kind of conspiracy theory has done it. So I'm kind of thinking like about that. I don't know, Hilary, what do you think the role of mutual aid groups is in just like flipping that script a little bit? And particularly, I think, and obviously in particularly in rural areas, but that's true of everywhere, because that's the claim the far right makes on people, is that they can build community, they can support families, they can support ways of life, that kind of thing.
Right, for sure. Well, it also, I'm from California in the mountains, northern and eastern, and, everywhere where I've ever spent time in California since I've left has like burned up and burned down. And my dad's still there and was one of the people, the Caldor fire was like 1 mile from his house. And he was more committed to stay at his house to get rid of looters, quote unquote looters, and to defend his land from a fire and these people than he was to more inclined to do that than he was to like receive help from his neighbor to get the animals off the property and move his trucks and do all that kind of stuff. And that really stuck with me as well. It was like, what gets in our folks, and I would say poor working class white folks, that's who I'm speaking to, is like where you're more committed to certain ideals and unwilling to receive those mutual aid pieces. And simultaneously, these are our same folks that really know mutual aid and don't call it that, right? We just like take care of each other, make sure we have what we need. You know what's happening with your neighbor down the street. You just bring something by, or you coordinate, a can drive or whatever. You make sure that people have what they need. But what you talked about with that rural organizing project example, all of those relationships were intact. They actually just needed the right kind of conditioned support and reframing or redirecting for that to become more alive and more available to people, to where then the militia becomes obsolete, not needed. People can speak out and like push back in a way that's was definitely not there right before that happened. I would say that I don't know, like it actually is organizing is what shifts the conditions. And then in terms of like mutual aid projects, I mean, Ryan brought this up earlier, and I think that this is such a key point, is like, is it actually building power? Is it actually gonna leave a community more intact, stronger, more clear seeing, and with more tools available to either meet their needs or to fight back or to do a number of things, even after that project ends? And that question of like, is it our differences? Is it stuff that we care about together? That might be the thing that starts the conversation of our shared interest about why we do a thing together. But if you leave out the question of power and building collective power, I think that's one of the things that we often miss. I think, we are also scared of power. There's many reasons to be scared of power, but when we have positive experiences about that kind of local community being able to have each other's back, that's community power. So if anything, I think mutual aid projects, people write about this shit. I have nothing like super smart to say other than like, they're a conduit, they're an opportunity to do those things exactly, to reframe relationships and make meaning and like out those motherfuckers that we actually don't want in our community, but we do have needs. I think mutual aid projects are fantastic at that, but for the ones that I know of that are scared of power and like are wanting to stay small, that's where I'm like, okay, we need to do that simultaneous thing that we talked about earlier, right? That hyper local, get shit done, build that shit on lock, and still connect to something much bigger than us, whether or not we are the ones that are doing that work. But I hope that makes sense. But I feel like mutual aid projects are both super fucking important. And then if that's the only thing you're doing, you become irrelevant really quick.
Right. I think it's also like people don't, I think there's a certain unrecognizableness to relationships that are different from the ones you have. Like to not notice that actually in rural areas, they're doing mutual aid all the fucking time, more often than I am in my city with my neighbors, like very much more frequently. For a totally different book project, I was interviewing this Hasidic Jewish rabbi from Chabad rabbi, and he identifies as a socialist, but he was talking about why that's a real tough sell in the communities he runs in. And one of the points he made is like, I could go in and I could talk about revolution. The people I'm talking to, their family members were run off by the Red Army, then they were run off by the White Army, then they were run off by Nazis who called themselves revolutionaries and this and that. Basically, they had all these experiences with revolution. So maybe revolution doesn't work, but and maybe they've never heard the term mutual aid, but that's all they literally do. They understand that concept, and they understand really big time building a community, and they understand healing the world or trying to like fix things. So if I talk to that language, if I'm like employing those things with them, suddenly the whole thing changes, you know. And I feel like there's an issue when we come into those spaces and expect them to like brand themselves the same way we do, or speak or to tell their story in the same way we do. And then hold that standard. And of course, people aren't going to meet it, and then we don't totally disconnected. There was a question that came in. So basically, in the introduction of my book, I say that anti-fascism is activism and organizing taken by people outside the state and law enforcement. So they want to know a little bit more about this. And I think they gave the example of like, what about like, you know, bleeding fascists suing them for resources, like the Science versus Kessler lawsuit, the one that, you know, is costing, you know, Matt Heimbach and Richard Spencer a bunch of money. Would that be a less useful, like, is that different? I think, you know, so I talk about lawsuits in my last book. I have a chapter about the SPLC lawsuits, and the SPLC, for all of its fault, has had some very effective lawsuits. There's really no way to argue that the lawsuits didn't take down some organizations, right? The United Clans of America, White Aryan Resistance, the Aryan Nations Compound no longer exists because it was sued by the SPLC, and they lost their property. There's some other organizations in there. They basically have been effective in that way. Is that anti-fascism? I think there's a different question when we're talking about what anti-fascism is versus what any particular situation requires. So I think lawsuits are an interesting idea. They don't, I think, have the same effect of building community, to use the community's pressure as what actually is the fulcrum there. So it's about the approach, maybe more so than what is the right situation. It's what we call anti-fascism is that collective action. I think the comparison, though, the explicit black and white difference is law enforcement. I think like law enforcement, which, you know, cops have taken down many fascist groups who are plotting different things, not nearly as many as there have been fascist groups for obvious reasons. And there's this kind of romantic notion that like maybe you don't want like the FBI, you don't like police in the general sense, you feel uncomfortable with them, but it's sort of seductive to think that you can use them against your enemies, that, you know, like maybe in this case, the police are good. And you have all these volunteers. I talked about in the introduction, the people who volunteered to go through social media stuff for the FBI to try and capture folks who were in the January 6th insurrection. So they're going through like live streams and trying to locate folks, empower the FBI. I think what people miss in that situation is that the FBI is using that, and they will use the exact same techniques they learned in this process against us, against anti-fascist, anti-capitalist protesters and that kind of thing. Those tactics will continue the state apparatus. And so in doing so, you're participating with them growing their ability to kind of target folks, because they don't care that these folks are racist. They care that they are, you know, breaking the law. They care that they're engaged in illegality. And so I think when we're thinking about anti-fascism, we're specifically thinking about us not as allies to the state, but as acting as community sense outside of it. And so this gets back to, I think, to a concept we talk about a little bit in the book. Actually, Matt Lyon's chapter talks about this really heavily, which is a three-way fight. That in like a struggle, there's not just two sides. They're not just, you know, the left or the workers or marginalized folks fighting for power, and then the state or the capitalist class or the folks that own resources on the other side. There's also a class of folks that aren't exactly either, that they're maybe made up of folks of both sides. For example, privileged sectors of the working class, white workers, that actually are not just synonymous with the capitalist interest, but then also are not, you know, allies of us. And so what we're kind of doing here is not appealing to necessarily the ruling class to take care of these people for us, but we're actually taking care of them in a way that hopefully furthers the larger struggles we have. So we're not just empowering the police, which are then used against us, but we're actually part of a larger set of social movements where anti-fascism is a piece that protects them, but also builds the tactics and relationships and coordinates and coalitions that can further those sorts of things. So that's sort of the distinction I make. I don't know, do y'all have thoughts on this about like the kind of separation between anti-fascists and law enforcement or legal avenues?
One thing, not to plug my book, but there's a history that I'm very familiar with in No Fascist USA, which in the 80s especially, when after Greensboro and after, you know, the first wave of Unite the Right and coalition across right just putting ideological differences aside and choosing tactics together to fight against communists and anybody who's doing anti-racist work, especially in the South. There was a moment where folks, I would say, who are on our side, who would consider themselves anti-fascist, but maybe more part of like a civil rights background, were working with the FBI to quote unquote get the motherfuckers around Greensboro. And in some of these interviews I did around No Fascist USA, that was really hard for me to listen to, right? Like from this political moment, from my position now, to hear a mentor talk about, yeah, we would work with the state to try to get them and talk to them about that. And one thing that really struck out to me, I think I was talking to Mab Seacrest, is she was like, that would not be possible today. So much has shifted, and so much of our understanding about the state's role and in its ability to take those same measures, whether it's laws that are passed or tactics or whatever, to try them out, yes, against the right or the Klan or whatever, because that does have more social purchase and social like consent to do that, and even praise, but then turns it right back around on us. And she was saying that that was one of the things that she learned, you know, through the 90s, because that's when some of the backlash came, and then how relieved she is these days that that seems so far from what we would understand now as anti-fascist. The ability, you know, granted, some people work with the police and answer the door when they knock and all that kind of shit. That's, to me, that's just like a know your rights training waiting in the wings. But on a collective level, I feel like there's much more understanding that our fight is on multiple fronts, and colluding with the police, working with the police, giving them information, especially willingly, is just not part of what is possible, not condoned, is not part of what we do. And if that is what's happening, like that's more of a suspicion about, do we need to call somebody in really strongly and have some consequences and boundaries with them, and or are they part of the state, you know? Let's not go into the finger pointing direction with that, but like that being one of the main indicators of how we know who's on our side.
Yeah.
What do you think, Ryan?
Well, and I think practically, from like the first time, like there's just practically speaking, both in the particular experiences that I've had, as well as like what that shows about law enforcement, it in some ways was something that never really entered into the equation, because cops do not care about what happens in subcultural scenes. They actively do not care if you have like information that is directly like demonstrating, unless you can have like some really, really good specific stuff, that there is imminent risk of harm from this particular group or organization or what have you. They just do not care. It is not something that is anywhere on their bandwidth. So like most of the time in the stuff we were dealing with, it was never really even a question, because we already knew that this was not something they were interested in anyway. And like the first places where I encountered fascist cops was through heathenry, because those were folks that the Asatru Folk Assembly would use as their like promoters and spokespeople, that they would get people that were like cops or like firefighters or owns a small business, or, you know, the people that look nice and respectable and good stand-up pillars of the community type people. And that was something that was a big learning experience for me, of going, oh, like the general, because like the general vibe that existed and the general assumption was that white nationalists were coming into heathenry out of like prison groups like Aryan Nations and stuff like that. But what was actually manifesting in groups like the Asatru Folk Assembly was that the people who were in charge were like people like McNallen, who's never spent a day behind bars in his life, and other folks who were very big on presenting as these kind of respectable members of society, aside from that they're white nationalist pagans. So that both kind of showed that this stuff, like the way that power interacts with this stuff, and the way that people, not just like the state, but also different social institutions interact with these kind of ideologies, is not necessarily always going to be clear cut, because there will be situations where they might see benefits to working with it. And also, practically speaking, working with law enforcement on anything anti-fascist is just kind of dangerous without getting into like along with everything that you said, Hilary, just practically speaking, every single police department has at least one ghost skin. Like, it's safe to assume that is true because the FBI assumes that is true as of 2015 in that leaked intelligence assessment. So if you are expecting, like, particularly law enforcement to be helpful, giving information to the police might be the fastest way to get people that are doing anti-fascist work doxxed or facing trumped up charges or all kinds of other stuff. Like, I mean, we saw that in Berkeley when all that stuff was going down, of the police engaging in very clear selective enforcement as far as who was and wasn't allowed to come into, like, what they called like the Battle of Berkeley. Like, there was the like the day before when these guys were going to show up, they posted that they were going to show up and hang the mayor of Berkeley. And yet the mayor is out there and the police are out there saying that the anti-fascists are the ones who are dangerous. Like, we saw the police like letting Proud Boys walk on through with like baseball bats and stuff sticking out of their backpacks and stuff. Like, it was pretty obvious and cut and dry that these guys are not really on our side. They don't, like, I don't think that within at least the encounters I've had, that law enforcement sees like anti-fascists as anything better than another problem. And that's assuming that you're not dealing with ones who are just straight up Nazis.
You know, I think part of the question too is there's like a whole sphere, like an NGO sphere that's sort of there, I guess, to go, like, some of it's called countering violent extremism or like de-radicalization sphere. There's a number of these organizations with, you know, varying degrees of, you know, awfulness or helpfulness. It kind of depends on which one. But I think there's an interesting way that they actually kind of play, not just with anti-fascists, but the larger left. I think about, I'm writing a book on anti-Semitism, so in it we talk about the history of the Anti-Defamation League. And people kind of think of the Anti-Defamation League as, I don't know, maybe a little bit helpful. They do some monitoring work. They're not great on every issue, but, you know, like, you know, it's better to have them than not. That's sort of like the general attitude outside of like the rad left. And, you know, the history of the Anti-Defamation League is actually very, very tied up with the history of tamping down Jewish radical movements. You know, there's several waves of kind of immigration to the US of Jewish immigrants. And the earlier wave came from Germany and were a little bit more middle class. And the later waves of Eastern European immigrants were a lot more working class, very involved in labor unions, involved in socialist projects, either the Communist Party or the Socialist Labor Bund. And so the Anti-Defamation League was part of the way of taking up the energy to fight anti-Semitism and other issues, but taking it away from the radicals. So that we're going to have a more establishment way of doing that. And they immediately offered a version that one preference the kind of respectable middle class perspective first, and those people first, and their agendas first, and then informed on the radicals while kind of presenting themselves as the solution to the issues that the radicals were fighting. So it was a really effective way of actually shutting down the movements in their own community that were more popular and more effective. And so I think about that history sort of plays itself out in a lot of other realms, even not just in Jewish politics, but all over the place, of like, what are these groups kind of there to do? And it's hard too, because, you know, I'm sure we all know people that work at various ones of these groups that are really great folks that do great work and do their absolute best. And so I don't think it's like an issue on them. I think it's just thinking about how we think of ourselves in the organizing work in response to these. And I think the anti-fascism does present itself as a kind of different model of that. And I think those things sometimes are at odds with one another. And I think if we want anti-fascism to be simply more than just the stopgap, if we want it to be defensive and a part of a larger social movement, then we have to think about how to kind of maintain that kind of radical vision. We are almost out of time. I wanted to give a chance before we cut out, also to remind everyone to pick up the book from Firestorm. You can order it directly from Firestorm. We have to support bookshops like this. We have to keep them alive. It's really, really important. So do your best to support them directly. You know, both of you are organizers. Do you want to mention a little bit about the organizations that you both are currently working with, and if people are interested in checking them out?
Sure, absolutely. I already mentioned that I am a staff member at Showing Up for Racial Justice. We are a national organization, but have many, many chapters across the US, as well as local organizing projects, mostly in the South, mostly in rural communities, and mostly in poor and working class white communities. Our whole jam is to organize in majority working class white communities against racism, both to win the shit that our communities need and to build a broader multiracial working class movement. And we have many things that anybody can get involved in. Feel free to go to surj.org. And yeah, I'm the director of political education there, and I also run security for the organization. What about you, Ryan?
Well, I'm doing stuff of organizing the more radical strains of Norse practice into something a bit more together, and basically building that next step beyond just opposition to fascism to let's build something that is genuinely inclusive and liberatory. In my book, The Way of Fire and Ice, if you want information on more up-to-date stuff on that, you can head on over to onblackwings.com, and we've got online a couple of different online web groups and some local groups that are coming together in a couple of different parts of the country. And we also do online classes so that folks that are anywhere in the world can jump on in and participate, of course, date and time permitting. And yeah, I also do a couple of podcasts. One's a pagan podcast, the other is fiction.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for coming on with me, y'all. I really appreciate you doing this. I'll be doing a bunch of these. So we'll have some other online ones with other authors. There is 29 authors in the book. So I'm going to be grouping up with a bunch of folks and having convos for the next 6 months. So I encourage folks to come out, check out other ones. The next one, I believe, will be from Burning Books in Buffalo, but it'll be online. So I'll look forward to seeing folks there.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. It's just a fantastic event, covered a lot of ground. For anybody who is here tonight, if you registered for this event, you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording, so you can revisit some of what was talked about tonight. Like Shane mentioned, I dropped a link to the book, No Pasarán, in the chat there. Great way to support these authors and this movement and us at Firestorm as well. So do hope folks pick up a copy. And yeah, y'all, Firestorm will be in a new space next year. And we'd love to see you somewhere down the line as more books come out. And yeah, it'd be great to see you. All right, y'all, have a good night now.
Bye.
Everybody.
Bye.